Go ahead.
Call to order. I'd like to call the meeting to order. On behalf of the board, I would like to acknowledge the land we are meeting on today's traditional territory of many First Nations, including Chippewas of Georgina Island and Mississaugas of the Credit. These lands are now home to many diverse Indigenous peoples. We also acknowledge that York Region falls under Treaty 13 with the Mississaugas of the Credit and the Williams Treaty with several Mississauga and Chippewas First Nations. Any disclosure of interest? Seeing non-communication from Richard Stubbings, Assistant Deputy Minister, Public Safety, Ministry of the Solicitor General, dated April 27, 2022. I'll move to receive. Walter Pritchell, thank you. Steve? Seconded, thank you. Any opposition? Motion carries. Consideration of adoption of reports, disconnect from work policy, report of the regional solicitor. Who's going to start this one?
Will someone just talk about it a bit?
I'm happy to do an introduction through the board, through the chair. I'm joined by my colleagues, Steve Mayo, Victoria Choi, Anitra Besson-Sisavang, who are prepared to address questions in relation to this policy, the requirement for the policy, its application. We also have Mr. Fraser here who can assist us in answering any questions that the board may have. This is a fairly straightforward matter. There's a statutory requirement for all employers who have more than 25 employees to have a policy in place. That's the only requirement as described in the report. There is no other than directing that a policy to disconnect be in place. There is no direction as to what that policy must have, and accordingly, it's open to employers to craft their policy in a manner that most suits their employment situation. I think that this is a fairly self-explanatory, complies with our statutory requirement to have the policy in place by June 2nd, and subject to any questions that the board may have, which I will redirect to my colleagues. That's all I have to say. I agree with Mayor Bevilacqua that this is likely to be a relatively brief meeting as we walk the board through the rationale behind the policy, including any submissions from Mr. Fraser. And with that, I turn it back over to the board.
Yes, thank you so much for that. I mean, for the board members, look at the summary. Essentially, the key points say it all, and as well as the conclusion. It's of the 5-page document here. That all organizations with 25 or more employees must have a policy on disconnecting from workplace by June 2nd, as correctly pointed out by Dan. And tomorrow is June 2nd, so we have to do it today. And the policy should be reviewed on an annual basis to address business and employee needs, and that the policy will apply to board, staff, and members of the York Regional Police Service Board. And when you go to the conclusion, is that the policy basically affirms compliance with the ESA and its continued commitment to meeting the health and well-being of employees of the board and York Regional Police, while remaining committed to serving the communities of York Region. I think that's all self-explanatory, and there is a recommendation that the board adopt the proposed disconnect from work policy as set out in our attachment, and I need a mover for that, though.
Sure.
Jason.
Mr. Chair, I apologize for raising this at the last minute. I had a brief conversation with Mr. Kuzmic and Mr. Mayo. I'm going to suggest that there may need to be a small modification with respect to the policy. And it's for this reason that, as you're aware, under the Police Services Act, the board directs the chief, and that's a direct relationship, but the board cannot direct individual employees of York Regional Police under the act. So this policy purports to have the board direct managers and staff of York Regional Police, and I would suggest it has to be amended so that that's more indirect. I can advise that the chief already has his procedure ready to go to comply with this policy and to comply with the Employment Standards Act once this policy is in place. But I would suggest that there needs to be a couple of amendments to ensure that the line of direction is indirect from the board to staff. And so my suggestion is that the definition of staff in this policy should be amended to say board staff, and it should remove reference to members of York Regional Police or York Regional Police at all, because of course this policy should also apply to board staff directly, which would be under the charge of Ms. Avellino. And then I would also suggest that 5.1 is fine, because that's a direct relationship between the board and the chief. But for 5.2 and 5.3, I think it should be clarified that that's board management personnel and board staff. Again, the direct reporting relationship there, but it shouldn't apply directly to our staff. Our staff will be directed by the chief and the chief's procedure. I'm happy to take any questions with respect to those proposals.
Go ahead, Dan.
Thank you, and through you, Chair. I think Mr. Fraser's point is a legitimate one. What we were trying to do, and again, I'm going to refer this to Mr. Mayo, but the report is clear and the chief's directive is quite clear that while the requirement for the policy is explicitly not applicable to sworn officers, what we were trying to achieve is, and perhaps I agree with Mr. Fraser, it could have been done in a clearer way, and I support that amendment that he suggested. But it's certainly the uniqueness of having the chief's directive apply to sworn officers is, again, it's described in the report as a non-mandatory piece, but it reflects the spirit of wellness and employee care that is given by this organization. And we tried to capture that. It was implicit to us, at least, that while the board does not have the discretion to direct operational matters such as this, that it was implicit that direction would have to come through the chief. But I agree that with Mr. Fraser that could likely be, that language could be improved a bit. Mr. Mayo.
Yeah, Dan, I have a question here. This the board, basically, you're saying that this is applied to the board, not necessarily, and the board and the chief would have his own, obviously, right? But I'm just wondering, this is for all organizations with 25 or more employees. Does this board have more than 25 employees?
No, it does not. Well, it's
technically, yes.
Complex. Yes, it does, because the YRP are still employees of the board through that statutory relationship under the Police Services Act. So the applicability, the necessity of the board to have the policy under that definition is still there. And this is consistent that boards have that all police services boards have these policies under that stricter pursuant to the Employment Standards Act. Steve, do you have anything further to add to that?
Yeah, I think in its basic terms, the definition of staff, including all members of York Regional Police, that line would be struck so that it would be more identifiable just to apply to the board. But the board in 5.1 directs the chief to have a policy that complies with the ESA. And so the board is directing that there is compliance, both with its members that it directs directly, and also with the members that it directs indirectly through the chief by requiring the chief to have a parallel policy. So the board is covered in both ways. I think Jason's concern is simply the definition may suggest the board interference with a relationship that it's not with officers and civilians, which is not direct. And I think it's only a clarification. I don't think the intention was in the drafting to reflect that, but this is a modest correction that simply allows the board to be compliant on all levels and the chief to be compliant with the board's direction.
Yeah, but see, I mean, to me, as long as it's in keeping with our oversight provision, right? I mean, that's what you really need as a board, and that's consistent throughout everything that we do, right? So that's kind of implied, right? Okay, Jennifer.
Thank you. Just two quick comments. I think some other peer police services boards do not have anything applied to the sworn officers. But I fully understand we want to hold us to a higher level in terms of supporting the health and wellness of all our employees. And then the other thing is the standard work hours. I think throughout pandemic, everyone's standard work hours change. It's no longer 9 to 5, and we already have flexible work hours. So just on the annual review or going forward, hopefully this will not cause more absenteeism or drop in productivity, but we will see. So I'm just wondering, normally when we develop policies like this, do we check with the other major police services boards among the Big 12 how it is? But I know this is a little bit beyond our own board. I'm actually bringing up at the OAPSB level because some consistency in application and development of policies across the province should be looked at.
Okay. Anyone else? Any comments on Jennifer's comments? Jason, go ahead.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and through you. And yes, I was involved in a number of meetings where we've had those same discussions. And ultimately, we recognize that we are going to be a leader in this, and that I suspect other police services will follow in time. But we've decided at the earliest of opportunities that we're going to apply this to all of our members, sworn and civilian. And that's not only consistent with all of the steps that we've taken to address the health and wellness of our members, but also to address breakthrough and the efforts that we are taking to modernize the culture of policing. And that includes bridging the divide between our sworn and civilian members. Because the reality is, when it comes to shift work, and when it comes to who may have to come to work on an emergency basis, it's the divide isn't between a police officer or civilian, because in any circumstance, you might have civilians that have to be called in. You might have police officers, whereas in other circumstances, you might have police officers and civilians side by side doing purely administrative 9 to 5 roles. So really, there is no delineation there. Instead, we've created a policy that applies to everyone, subject to there being clear direction on there's always going to be the need for communication outside of hours when there are operational needs or when there are exigent circumstances. But the reality is that those operational needs and exigent circumstances could apply to a detective, or it could apply to somebody in records who needs to be called in to do up the bail, records for a bail hearing on a big takedown. So that's the rationale for us deciding that we were going to apply this to all members of York Regional Police across the board. But we take your point, Ms. Fang. It's subject to clear direction to ensure that that we're still meeting the needs of the organization, and also mindful that regardless of whether you're sworn or civilian, we have a dozen or so different work schedules. Depending on which area you're in. So we have officers and civilians that work shift work. We've got administrative folk like myself that work 8 to 4. So that part is going to take some navigation on the part of our members, because you're going to have to check to see what schedule the person's working, to try and be mindful that just because you're working 8 to 4, it doesn't mean that that person isn't working until 3 o'clock in the morning. I'm happy to take any questions.
Okay. Jennifer, any other comments or questions? If not, can somebody tell us exactly what the changes are going to be? Because if there are going to be some amendments, we're going to have to move them and approve them. Can we have the wording? So, and Jennifer, once you hear the wording, maybe you can move it. Go ahead, Stephen.
Mr. Chair, I think the simple amendment would be to strike the reference to all members of York Regional Police that sits in the staff definition.
Okay.
You could add further clarity, but I think that's the simplest. And I think once that definition is changed, and I'll look to my friend Jason to concur, the 5.2 and 5.3 then just refer back to the definition. So I think that that's the simplest.
Okay.
And I would only add that also the or York Regional Police at the end, because that That modifies the other persons working on behalf of York Regional Police, which would also fall under the direction of the chief.
Maurizio,
Yes,
if I may suggest, this is the practice that OSC board does, because we do a lot of policy development and there are these kind of minor adjustments out to board meetings. So what the practice is, we will have a quorum of 2 directors and then allow the team to make the adjustments as long as the adjustments are non-material. And the quorum of the 2 directors can work with the team to finalize it. And I know that this has to be approved today because deadline is tomorrow. So if you want to make a motion, the board has reviewed and then will agree to minor non-material adjustments by the legal team, and a quorum by email or whatever, by email later, the board can approve it. Something just for your
Okay.
consideration, please.
all right. So we just need some wordsmithing on this. Mafalda, do you, or even Jason or Stephen or Dan?
I'd say this can be taken care of very quickly and easily. Anitra, if you're prepared to share your screen and demonstrate the striking of the 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10 words, then you can approve it now, board, and we can put this policy in place.
Okay, please bear with me for a moment while I share the screen.
While Anitra's doing that, if you are following along, it's in the definition section under section 4. Staff is the second to last definition, and it's simply striking the reference to members of York Regional Police. So it will remain to read: staff means board staff, volunteers, agents, and other persons working on behalf of the board, full stop.
Okay. That satisfy everybody? Jennifer, you okay with that?
So staff now become board staff, volunteers, agents? No.
Correct, and
just
other
board
persons.
staff.
And other persons working on behalf of the board, full stop. This leaves the direction to the chief to put the policy in place as it concerns all members of York Regional Police, which is directed by the board in 5.1.
Yeah, because 5.1 will stay, right? The board
Correct.
can direct the chief to have the policy in place to be in compliance.
That is correct.
Is it just 5.3 then, Steve?
Just the staff definition, just as Anitra has presented on the screen right now. This is the only change.
Okay,
Thank you.
so that's pretty, Jennifer, does that satisfy you?
Yeah.
Okay, Walter?
Yes.
Okay, Steve, so everybody? Anyone else? Are there any other comments? If not, we'll proceed with the recommendation. And obviously the recommendation includes also the change made, the amendment made. Is that okay with everybody? Okay. Who would like to move that? Jennifer, would you like to move that? Walter, would you like to second that?
Sure.
Walter?
Yes.
Any opposition? Motion carries. We now move to confirmatory bylaw. Would like to move that? Steve? Would you move that for me? And is Norma here? Norma present? Norma, do you mind seconding that? Okay. Any opposition? Motion carries. And now I need someone to move adjournment. And Jennifer, thank you. And Walter, you want to second that? Thank you. Any opposition? Motion carries. Have a great day.